CBSE Board, Class 11, History, Chapter 3, Part 11, Audio by Renee Matthew. Rulers started dispensing with the system of feudal, and they understood that the system is not going to prolong for a long time. And also with their armies, they started introducing professionally trained infantry. Now, the peasants who were not so skilled were replaced by knights. After that, now we learned that the rulers were purposely strengthening their military and economic powers. So now they had people who were trained to take part in the military affairs, and they were equipped with guns and siege artillery, which was under their control directly. So all the affairs of the state was directly controlled by the rulers. The resistance of the aristocracies, that is, the aristocratic people, were really very arrogant. That started crumbling. Now the all-in-all power was given to the kings. That crumbled in the face of the firepower of the kings. No longer the kings were dependent on the aristocratic group. Okay, they had their own power, they had their own strategies, and they had their own laws also. Now we have to look into a major important section of this particular part, which is taxes. How and why the taxes were levied. Earlier we saw that the peasants also had to give tax to the landlords, to the nobles and all those people, and they in turn paid taxes to the king. Now what was a new procedure in the face of new economic power? Taxes were increased, and of course the monarchs were clever enough to collect revenues to support their large armies. Now their only aim was to strengthen their army, just like how Genghis Khan did in Mongol Empire. And like that, they started defending and expanding their frontiers, and they started overcoming their internal resistance to royal authority. Okay, so they started resisting the rules and regulations and the guidelines which was given by the royal authority. So they started defending and expanding their frontier, and it was a great resistance to the royal people. Now, the centralization did not occur without resistance. Centralization means what? Focusing on the power of the king did not or could not happen without the king resisting the power of the aristocratic people. They had to say a no to the guidelines given by the aristocratic people for them to centralize and focus their power in their own hands. So a kind of common thread was running through all types of opposition to the monarchies, and that was the question of taxation. Load of opposition was faced, especially with regard to taxation, and people started revolting against it. Rebellions occurred from here and there, and in spite of the rebellions, it was actually put down in 1497, 1536, 1547, and 1549, 1553. In all these phases of life, rebellions were actually suppressed and it was put down. Now we have to go into detail about Louis XI. He waged a long struggle, especially against dukes and princes, completely against them. Lesser nobles, often members of local assemblies, resisted this royal usurpation of their powers. So nobles, because they were not encouraged now. Earlier the kings were very close to the nobles. Now the king was like, he took control of the whole place. If suppose it is France, he took control of France completely, and of course the nobles were very unhappy. Earlier the peasants used to have revolts. So now the nobles, they were members of the local assemblies, they started opposing the king, resisted this kind of royal usurpation. That is, by force the king had gone to power, and the king had complete force over the whole land. The complete state was controlled and it was completely under the domination of the king, authoritative power. There were a lot of religious wars which took place in France, especially in the 16th century, and that was a kind of contest between the royal privileges and regional liberties. Lot of wars took place in France, and it was like a competition between the royal people and the regional liberties. So it was a fashion in those days to have these religious wars. This is a picture of Louis XI, okay, And now we have to take a look at the nobility. What was the status of the nobility? Because they were the ones who resisted the authoritative and despotic rule of the monarchies, especially the absolutist rule of the monarchy. The nobility managed to have a tactical shift. They were clever enough to have a shift in order to ensure their survival. They understood that they have to survive somehow, and they cleverly had a shift. Now, what was this shift? They were opponents to the new regimes. They were not happy with the new changes. But what happened? They started opposing the king very badly. What did the king do? The king conveniently suppressed the nobles. Now they understood, if they are going to further prolong their resistance to the king, what will happen? The king will throw them out of the dukedom. So what did they do? They transformed themselves into loyalists. They pretended as if they were loyalists to the king, and they started serving the king. So royal absolutism was very powerful. It has been called a modified form of feudalism. From feudalism, royal absolutism came into being. This is a very important point. They can also ask you, how did feudalism evolve into royal absolutism, where you have to give all these points that we discussed in the last 20 minutes, the previous slides also. The same class of people who were rulers in the feudal system, people who ruled, people who had all the privileges, were known as the lords. Do you remember they had manorial estate and all that? They'd continue to dominate the political scene because they knew that they will not be able to prolong with this kind of strategy, so they started acting as royalists. So they started dominating the political scene. Who? The lords. So that was the status of the lords, where they continued to serve the king. There was no other go for them. They started getting permanent positions in the administrative service, and somehow the new structure, the new government was very different in some important ways. Although they were given permanent positions in the administrative section, let's see what happened, whether they were happy, whether it was prolonged luxury. The king. Now, what are the powers of the king? The king was not at the apex of a pyramid. Okay, so loyalty, where loyalty had been a matter of personal dependence and trust. The king was not at the top now. He was actually at the center of an elaborate courtyard around him. And there was a whole network surrounding him, and that was known as the patron-client relationship. So everybody was reporting to the king. He was a patron and all the others were client. So this is more dangerous than having the king on top. Earlier we had the king at the top, that is at the apex of the pyramid. All the monarchies were weak. Okay, whether they were weak or powerful, they of course needed the cooperation of this particular people, those who could command authority. They needed the cooperation of all these people. So, nobles were also struggling to get into the administrative positions, but king also realized that without the help of the nobles and the aristocratic group, nothing could be done. What do you mean by patronage? It was a way of ensuring cooperation. Patronage meant cooperation, and that is why I told you that the king is always in the center, where he ensured that there was a network surrounding him, all around him, and that particular system was known as the patron-client relationship. So, the patronage was a form of ensuring cooperation, and patronage could be given, or you can actually go for a patronage only by means of money. Money had to be given. So money was a very important way in which non-aristocratic elements, people who were not a part of the nobles like the merchants and bankers, they took advantage of this, because without money you cannot get patronage. They started paying to the landlords. They started paying the lords with money so that they could get an access to the court. They wanted some kind of access to the court so that they could also have a share in the court. They started lending money to the kings because they were rich. They had so much of possession, and the kings used it to pay as wages for soldiers. Okay? Rulers, because of that, started making space for non-feudal elements in the state system. So when they paid to the kings used it to strengthen their military system. So the only target of a king was to strengthen his economic and military power. So when the money was given, when so much of money was actually pooled in, the king used it to pay the soldiers, and definitely the soldiers had to be given money and also very good nutritious food. So these were the powers of the king. So it is not that the king was the all in all. Of course, it was absolutism that prevailed. But after some time, the king also understood that nobles are required. Their cooperation is actually required. Now we have to look at how the history of France and England changed, how it got shaped by the changes in the power structures. There was a lot of change in the power structures, and thus the history of France and England got changed, especially in the reign of the child king. Louis XIII of France was a very small child king, and in 1614, there was a meeting which was held of the French Consultative Assembly. Okay, and this meeting was known as the Estates General. It had 3 houses to represent, 3 estates, namely clergy, nobility, and the rest. All of them had a meeting. After this, it was not called for another 2 centuries. Earlier, they used to have this meeting, and we saw this in the previous classes of history, especially in 9th and 10th classes, where Estate General was not called for a long time, till 1789, when it paved the way for French Revolution. Till then, the kings were not bothered about Estate General. So after 1789, the kings actually did not want to share power with the 3 orders, and that is why they did not call the Estate General. But after 1789, they were actually forced to call the Estate General, especially Louis XIII. From Louis XIII, this problem started. This is the king, okay, Louis XIII. He was a child king, and he was not sure of how to proceed with the matters, the state matters. Now, this is something which happened in France. Now, what happened in England? That was something very different from what happened in France. The House of the Lords were the members of which were the lords and the clergy. The House of Lords meant people who were lords and clergy. These 2 groups came under House of the Lords. Next group is House of Commons. It represented towns and rural people. From the name itself, you can understand. Lord means higher class. Commons means normal people. Okay? Now, even before the Norman conquest, that is before the French invaded England, that is the Anglo-Saxons, they had a great council. Their ruling system was better actually, where the king always was required to consult with a body before he imposed any tax. The king was forced to consult before imposing any tax. And this developed into what was known as the Parliament. Okay, so from then itself, the king used to consult before imposing any tax. And this Parliament was divided into 2 parts, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So this was a system which was prevalent in England, and that actually helped the ruling classes to an extent because there was a great division. Alright, now we need to look at King Charles I. He ruled for 11 years. Earlier we saw that it was this particular king who ruled in France, and he was a child king. He did not have any access to many things. He did not know how to consult. So it just continued like that till the French Revolution. But in England we saw the division. We saw how the Parliament functioned. The king was King Charles I. He ruled for 11 years. The period is given here. Without calling the Parliament, he ruled. When he was forced to call it, he will call because he needed money and he wanted to strengthen his power. A section of Parliament decided to go to war against him. He called it just to have money. Okay. But there were a few people who were against him because he did not call the Parliament all the time. Okay. And because of that, he was executed, and then the people themselves, that central Parliament itself, established a republic. So people in England used to revolt against the king because he never called for the Parliament. But in France, it was not like that. It just went on. Only after French Revolution, there was a great uprising. So when the king failed to call the Parliament, in England, things were different. The Parliament started opposing him, and they got him executed. This is King Charles I. Now, this did not last for long, but though the republic was actually established, we can see later in history that the monarchy was restored. To rule England as a republic is impossible when you have the monarchy, when you have their lineage falling. So, monarchy was restored by force, but it was restored on the condition that Parliament would be called regularly. So, that was the condition which was given by the Parliament, that you should consult with the Parliament regularly. Okay, and in the next upcoming slide, we have to see the kind of republican form of government which was prevalent in France. Did you understand this much? So they came in terms with the monarchy saying you should consult with the parliament regularly and not once in a while.